All right, good evening, folks. It's great to see you all. Good crowd here. Tonight we have Miles O'Brien, a good friend of Denise and I, and he's going to present to us a presentation that he gave kind of the other half of this, if you will, or the same idea in Abu Dhabi maybe a year or so ago. And that went over really well with the folks there. And so Denise and Miles arranged that we also have it here. Some of you, maybe all of you, know Miles because you see him on TV, on CNN, and mostly the last few years, PBS NewsHour, and also the Nova programs, participating in that. There's a movie or documentary we watched that you created, I believe it was about megafires, maybe just a month or two ago, focused on California. And Miles came to Greenland with us, I don't know, 5 years ago, and it was the NSF Science Nation, working on that. And most recently, Miles sent Aurora and I with a camera to Antarctica to film, and so that came out on PBS NewsHour, and I thought you did a great job on that, presenting a very clear presentation. I thought a non-political tone. I thought it was very powerful, and it's just here it is. So that's the kind of work Miles has been doing. And one other thing I mentioned is Miles is also an aviation expert. And so every now and then you'll see him on discussing aviation, and it's a big passion of Miles. So tonight, let's jump to this really interesting story, focused largely on how the word climate and climate change, essentially how we've dealt with it and learned about it over the last century is part of what this is. So it's a very unique perspective Miles brings, because he's bringing it as a journalist and about how this has been communicated. So, with no further ado.
If it plays in Abu Dhabi, maybe it'll be good in New York. It's kind of like, taking the Broadway show to Detroit first. Actually, is that I can test Abu Dhabi? Maybe it's the other way around. It's good to see you all here. I want to talk to you about media coverage of climate change, which really in some respects could be an oxymoron. In some cases, because we don't see a lot of it, although that is changing over time. This is perhaps because of events. I just got back from Australia, where the fires have been epic and continue. It's still very early in the fire season there. Huge consequences for that. Australia is one of the most vulnerable countries on the planet, developed countries on the planet, when it comes to climate change. Storms, we know they're getting stronger, more frequent, and we know they're wetter. And they don't even have to be a hurricane to cause an awful lot of difficulty. Ask the folks in Houston about that. And this is a place that David is all too familiar with, the West Antarctic ice sheet, quakes in particular. Brand new data, which I guess we can't say too much, hasn't been fully published yet. But the point is, the water beneath that ice sheet is too warm for the Thwaites Glacier to remain stable. And if we lose the Thwaites Glacier, pretty much the West Antarctic ice sheet will follow. And that equates to about 10 feet of sea level rise, which I don't think would make my ankles wet here, but pretty close. So people are paying attention. They see the Great Barrier Reef, terrible coral bleaching events, not just there, but all around the world. Coral is extremely sensitive to temperature change. So what we're seeing, I guess one way to look at it in a half full way is we have things now to point a camera at and to explain to people and to get them at least focused. For many years at CNN, I was covering basically the story of polar bears, and it's all seemed kind of remote and distant, but these days it's coming right home. And here's what's driving it, of course. These numbers are familiar to, I'm sure, a lot of you. This is the Keeling curve, the famous Keeling curve, which dates back to the late 50s, Mauna Loa, Hawaii. Now hovering, staying well above 400 parts per million, which is above the numbers people say will get us anywhere into a safe zone as far as controlling climate change or reaching the Paris agreements. This extrapolates it out using ice cores. You can see that peak in the right. That's where we are right now. Kind of hard to refute these numbers, although there are still some denialists out there who would tell you this really isn't happening. But I think the public is kind of coming along here. about 4 in 10 Americans now believe that climate change is harming them in some level. Gallup will tell you 66% of Americans correctly identify human activity at the root of climate change, of global warming, the climate emergency. And most Americans actually favor taking some action about it. These are all really important and good trends. If you hear what's going on in Washington, you might think a little bit of a disconnect there. We can talk a little bit more about that later. Why is this happening? Some of that has to do with the likes of Greta Thunberg, these grassroots movements, which have really taken hold all throughout the world. Again, if you want to go half full, the lack of leadership in Washington has created a vacuum and has spurred a lot of local action. You know, what would we do without the state of California if we were worried about climate? So the consequence of that is that an increase, reasonable increase, in media coverage. These are charts that are compiled by the University of Colorado, Max Boykoff. There is an excellent researcher who tracks media coverage of climate. You can see the steady, there are peaks and valleys depending on what the story is, whether it's the Paris Agreement or Al Gore movie or whatever it might be. But basically what we see is an upward trend. This is newspaper coverage of climate change. Good news, right? This is television coverage, a little more erratic, a little more spiky. And if you really start looking at some of these spikes, a lot of it has to do ultimately with politics. It turns out that much of the coverage, like so much of the coverage we see on television right now, has to do one way or another with President Trump. And we know where President Trump stands on climate change, don't we? Yeah, that's our commander-in-chief. As much as 79% of the climate change coverage that we see on the broadcast networks focuses one way or another on a statement or a tweet or something that President Trump has made. So we have to really look at the kinds of stories we do. Are these the stories that really explain what's going on? Are these the stories that give us some kind of levers to action and solutions? Not so much. This is my opportunity to the horn of PBS and the PBS NewsHour. If you support us, we will get you a tote bag, I promise. But this report just came out. Good timing for this speech. The Media Matters group took a look at the coverage by the broadcast networks versus PBS, and that is the PBS coverage of climate change from 2017 to 2019. You'll see in 2019 we ramped it up significantly. I have been pushing this one very hard myself. There are others at NewsHour who have worked very hard to make this a front and center issue at the NewsHour. But that is more than all of the other networks combined by a long shot. And again, the coverage that you see there is frequently, some Trump tweet and a reaction to it. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get the corporate media and players to do their job properly. Among the things, and forgive me while I just kind of say how great the PBS NewsHour is, because I consider myself so fortunate to work for them because they do actually care about stuff I care about. The total number of segments by ABC, CBS, and NBC combined was 116. We did 121. Generous segment on climate by corporate nightly news enterprises are 2 to 3 minutes at best. We do 8 to 9 minutes. And they said the PBS NewsHour avoids shallow and vapid reporting. That just warmed my heart right there. So that's enough of the plug for the PBS NewsHour. We hope you are all at least somewhat frequent viewers, because we do try to make these subjects and others, and science coverage in general, an important part of the news diet, which has kind of gone asunder, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment. Just this past year, I went to Australia, as I told you, did a series of reports there on the fires, and we also just put a piece on the air. I hope you had a chance to see it. We're calling him the Martin Scorsese of Antarctica. David Holland. This is a great case of when you get turned down making lemonade out of lemon. Well, I was supposed to be with him. Would have been a 2-month thing, and Aurora too. And but the BBC got the slot. Actually, they got both slots, which is upset me quite greatly. So I went over to B&H and bought him every cool camera gadget I could imagine, outfitted him in one day of a crash course, and he came back with fantastic footage. So give this guy a round of applause, because I can tell you this, he can be a filmmaker, but I can't be a scientist. So here's a little excerpt of what we did. Well, so David just told me that he can't go to Abu Dhabi because of the coronavirus thing. I was thinking maybe you just come with us on our stories and do some shooting, because you did a fine job. So we're always looking for ways to tell the story this way. If it means giving cameras to scientists, we will do that. If it means spending 2 months in the ice, we'll do that. We are committed to that, and hopefully our journalistic brethren will come along. A little bit about me. I want to tell you about me. Full disclosure, I'm not a scientist. I play it on TV. I have a production company based in Boston. I studied history in college. I had some bad experience with the periodic table in high school, avoided science. I stumbled into journalism, somewhat sober, and ended up working as a local news reporter in Albany, New York, Tampa, Florida, and Boston, where in 1992 I heard that CNN was looking for a science correspondent. And while I had a little bit of PTSD over science, I did think CNN would be a good place to work. So I managed to cobble together a reasonably good tape, at the time we used that, sent it down to the former molecular biologist who was the science editor for CNN at the time, Bailey Barish, and she brought me down for a 2-day interview. 2 days. Like maybe got through the story, reading from the camera, and she gave me a written and oral exam on science. You can imagine how that went. She said, so tell me about climate change. And I was looking for the thermostat in the room to see if she wanted me to change it. So I got to the end of the ordeal, and by the way, I did come down in one of those just to make sure that, increase my IQ. And I got to the president of CNN, Bob Fernand, and he's kind of at his desk and he's looking at my folder without even looking at me. He says, well, obviously you don't know shit about science. So what do you say at that point, right? Any thoughts? Actually, I said, that's why you want to hire me. Because you don't know anything about science either, nor does your audience. And I can tell you right now, I'm not afraid of it. And I actually welcome the challenge of explaining it. I thought that was a little bit of a stretch, but it actually was true. And so the rest is history. I learned science from Nobel laureates and the best scientists in the world. What a privilege that has been. And I discovered that if I hadn't gotten derailed at the periodic table, science was really interesting, and somehow it just didn't get taught very well to me. That's another subject for another speech, and it all worked out well for me, I think, doing what I'm doing now. But I found it to be endlessly fascinating. What I love about, I love journalism, of course, but what I love about science journalism is most journalists dwell on problems. That's the job, right? There's not a lot of solutions in journalism. Scientists, by definition, are looking at solutions. And so I appreciate the fundamental, optimism of science, that we can tackle big problems and solve them. So it's been a great ride for me. Okay, history. Let's do a little history since I am the history major. You guys are all smart people, so just stop me if I'm going on and on about this. This is the man who gave us the greenhouse effect, all right? Svante Arrhenius, who in 1896 wrote a paper that suggested, at least theoretically, April of 1896, that as carbon dioxide would create a greenhouse effect for the planet, and that emissions could eventually cause trouble, but he felt that or at least most scientists felt that the impact of this would be rather small, that the oceans as a heat sink would take care of it, that it didn't have great consequence. But there was the theory out there. It's been around for a long, long time, despite what the denials will tell you. This is the only article that anybody can find subsequent to this paper coming out, which was from the Morgantown, North Carolina News Herald. And it just says a hint to coal consumers that a Swedish professor has evolved a new theory of the extinction of the human race. Like, I don't know, does that mean by more or less coal? I don't know. He holds that the combustion of coal by civilized man is gradually warming the atmosphere. In the course of a few cycles of 10,000 years, the Earth will be baked in a temperature close to the boiling point. I should tell you at this time, this era, journalism, professional journalism was kind of just evolving. And certainly science journalism had not come of age. There wasn't a lot of mainstream coverage that was focused on what the papers were. There was, of course, Popular Mechanics in 1911 did a fairly extensive takeout on climate change and what it means. Again, putting it in the distant horizon, and again, still in the theoretical realm, because nobody had really put any data against that theory that Arrhenius had put forward. Then there was a little bit of coverage. This is the Boston City Globe in the 19-teens. Talks about Boston being 150 feet beneath the sea. Picture the Atlantic rising and flooding Boston 150 feet underwater with codfish swimming in and out of office windows, clams and oysters growing on roofs, and great tangles of seaweed flourishing in the public gardens. So were people paying attention? Probably not, but there was a modicum of coverage. 20s and 30s, journalism started coming of age, and the science started to get a little more real. 1938, guy Stewart Callendar, he tried to take Arrhenius' theory and put a little data against it. He compiled some measurements of temperatures from the 19th century on. He correlated those measurements with atmospheric CO2. And he was the first one to ever really come up with any sort of link between carbon dioxide and global warming. Interestingly though, Callendar was among the people who believed this would be beneficial. It would delay a return of deadly glaciers, he said. His work, pretty much unnoticed in the media. In Time magazine in 1939, this is about the only thing in the 30s that was out there. Science, Warmer World. Gaffers who claimed that winters were harder when they were boys are quite right. Weathermen have no doubt that the world is, at least for the time being, growing warmer. World War II, nobody was paying much attention to climate change in World War II, I guess for obvious reasons. Then the 50s, there was, again, the coverage started to take root in some places. This is from the Saturday Evening Post. Big picture spread, kind of the television of its time. And they quoted some serious scientists. This one, Dr. Hans Almond, Swede again. Ordinary people are beginning to realize that something has happened weather-wise. It is happening which is of great interest to themselves. If older people say that they have lived through many more hard winters in their youth, they are stating a real fact. But then it gets a little wacky. Wait to see some of the causes they come up with here. People are asking questions. Is the weather actually changing or just experiencing a few freak seasons? And here's some of the theories. Is the sun throwing out more heat? Perhaps getting ready to explode or snuff out all life on Earth in a matter of seconds? Yikes. Is the solar system in its 12-mile-a-second spiral through the Milky Way or Sol's home galaxy emerging from the last flimsy fringes of a cloud of cosmic dust, which for centuries has prevented a small but critical portion of our luminaries' radiation from reaching the Earth? Wow, that's good writing, huh? Has atomic experimentation upset delicate thermal balances, perhaps by increasing molecular activity in the atmosphere? Is the warming up process worldwide or really regional? Interesting, they didn't mention Arrhenius at all. There was a paper from 1896, which they might have cited, but they came up with some other ideas. You know, some of this cherry-picked stuff is still in play in some respects, in certain denialists. 1950s, a little more data now. Gilbert Plass, like so many great scientific things, he was assigned to figure out how to make heat-seeking missiles work better. So he was studying infrared radiation absorption by the atmosphere, and as a result became pretty quickly an expert on CO2 concentrations. And he predicted that a doubling of CO2 would warm the planet by 3.6 degrees Celsius, and that CO2 levels in 2000 would be 30% higher than in 1900, and that the planet would be 1 degree Celsius warmer in 2000 and 1900. Amazingly accurate numbers for a guy who was using some of the earliest punch card computers. So scientific win for Dr. Plass. So let's move into the era of television, my era. And this is one of the first films, TV events that in any way got into the issue of climate change. This is called The Unchained Goddess. And it was a 1958 episode of a CBS series that was sponsored by Bell Labs. And the producer was no less than Frank Capra. And interesting, this was a full payment for him. The professor, Frank Baxter in this film, English professor at UCLA, and the straight man you may recognize, he was the leading man in The Creature from the Black Lagoon. But for the 1958, this thing is pretty forward-thinking. So that was, pretty forward-thinking stuff. Again, kind of a one-off thing. And then the 60s, our attention moved to environmental issues that were perhaps a little more closer to home, a little more issues that could be tackled more readily, put it that way. Of course, Silent Spring with Rachel Carson, published in 1962, the banning of DDT, huge significant events, obviously the Eagle itself being taken off the endangered list ultimately. Los Angeles smog addressed with the catalytic converter, and even Ronald Reagan in the 80s pushing for a solution to the acid rain problem after having a meeting with his counterpart, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. So it was kind of like these were low-hanging fruit environmental issues, and they were more addressable, more graspable, and the media was able to cover them because there was something to point a camera at. I said that before, but that is an important theme when you're talking about especially television coverage. So climate change, the 60s. Well, while the environmental coverage was going on, the man who gave us that Keeling curve, Charles David Keeling, at Scripps, was beginning his work. There are the numbers. There weren't many articles written about what he was doing at the time. The focus remained water and air pollution, subsequent to DDT, and then the banning on DDT. And then, of course, in 1970, that kind of culminated in the first Earth Day. We're about to come up on is it the 50th anniversary, isn't it? It is, wow, 50 years in April. And this is the first time, April 1970, that we know of climate change being mentioned at all on a nightly network newscast. So this is Frank Blair anchoring the NBC Nightly News in 1970. First of all, we'll show you his basic reporting on Earth Day itself. But aside from that, not a lot of serious journalism. Matter of fact, it was kind of taken as like a lot of science coverage has been historically, taken as what we call the kicker, the end of the show. In fact, no less than one of my heroes, Walter Cronkite in 1972, couldn't resist a little kicker on the subject at that time, which came into play, which was global cooling. Yeah, even Walter. So global cooling, a couple words on that. There were two articles in the 70s, 1975 actually, Newsweek and Time both did short articles, which focused on a couple of papers that were out there, very much outlier papers, which talked about the component, the possibility that the planet might cool. The scientific flaw in their thinking was sulfur dioxide, which of course does have a cooling effect. Anybody who remembers Mount Pinatubo erupting in the Philippines several years ago, that the atmospheric temperatures decreased for quite some time because of the reflective nature of sulfur dioxide. In any case, we took sulfur dioxide out of diesel buses and pollution, and that made this whole theory kind of, it was scientifically disproven pretty quickly. But what's very interesting about this is that I'm going to flash forward to present day, actually, the 2016 election, Senator Ted Cruz, and this is a familiar and frequent cherry-picked item among climate change denialists. Listen to what he says. In the 1980s, this whole subject finally got front page treatment, New York Times front page treatment. It's not coincidental that the 1980s were probably the absolute apex of science journalism. This is, before Facebook and Google kind of gutted my business, and for that matter, Craigslist took care of the newspapers. Daily newspapers routinely had science-focused journalist teams who all they did was cover science. Of course, the New York Times remains equipped that way, but at that time, science journalism was in its heyday. And this is, of course, when much of the data was really starting to come in, and James Hansen of NASA really got out there and began talking about it on Capitol Hill before a committee chaired by then Senator Al Gore. In 1981, the New York Times ran its first front page article, below the fold piece, talking about the issue of climate change. It says, very straightforward reporting, a team of federal scientists says it's detected overall warming trend in the Earth's atmosphere stemming back to 1880. They regard this as evidence of the validity of the greenhouse effect, in which increasing amounts of carbon dioxide cause steady temperature increases. The 7 atmospheric scientists predict a global warming of almost unprecedented magnitude in the next century. It might even be sufficient to melt and dislodge the ice cover of West Antarctica, they say, eventually leading to a worldwide rise of 15 to 20 feet of sea level. Pretty accurate stuff there, 1981. And then at this time, I think we forget, before some interested parties, shall we say, got involved in this subject, climate change was a very bipartisan issue. In the early 1990s, the elder George Bush was by no means a climate denier, was working with the IPCC, and was addressing science in a way that Republicans don't talk about science anymore. Listen to his rhetoric, and as you listen to it, close your eyes and imagine a Republican saying anything that he says here right now. Here, George H.W., right? I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of bipartisan rhetoric today? Interestingly, while he was saying that, the fossil fuel industry was getting nervous. Exxon, interestingly, had done some science. They put some sensors on board one of their tankers. That tanker went all over the ocean, and they gathered some irrefutable data that climate change was real and was happening, and their internal scientists knew full well. Externally, however, they were offering up, this was the tanker, externally they were offering up an entirely different view. It was the SO Atlantis, by the way, this was in 1979. But simultaneous to gathering all this data, they were doing their best to suppress it. They didn't like the data they were getting in, and they were purchasing, this is the route of the boat, they were purchasing a series of advertisements in the New York Times which emphasized the denialism very heavily. I call this the tobacco playbook because basically the people who tried to sow doubts about tobacco smoking and its link to cancer and other health effects, those very same people were hired by the fossil fuel industry to give us the message on climate change. Same tactics. And the basic idea is very simple. Just muddy the waters, show at least a modicum of uncertainty, and give people some little data point to grasp onto, and at the very least you will delay action. And delay is a win for them, there's no question about that. So a paper by Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran at Harvard found a couple of years ago, as they did a statistical analysis of their climate change communications versus the actual science that they had externally, made it very clear that it was completely divergent. The internal stuff, the red bars mean they're indicating the seriousness or whether it's deniable or whether it's doubt, I should say. Internally, there was, look at that lower right one. Internally, there's very low doubt expressed among the peer-reviewed, peer-reviewed science. But look at their editorials, which they put out in the Times and elsewhere, which stress the denialism. So it was a very concerted effort. You know, it's kind of, I guess not surprised, but there it is, in at least in a scientific approach to it, showing exactly what was happening. The tobacco playbook is strong and works, unfortunately. They muddy the waters, get people a little bit confused. The famous, or depending on which side of the aisle you're on, infamous pollster Frank Luntz, Republican pollster, offered up this very telling, what was supposed to be an internal memo at that time to the George W. Bush White House, which says, among other things, the scientific debate is closing against us. This is early 90s, by the way, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue of the debate and defer to scientists and other experts in the field. That's kind of a smoking gun right there, I guess you could say, for the whole approach, right? So, and he speaks, the talking points he sends out to Republicans become the talking points you see on cable news. Among the efforts that they did was they recruited a cadre of scientists who were willing to throw some doubt and denialism into the ring. One of those, they hired a couple dozen of them. One of them was a guy by the name of Willie Soon. He's a Malaysian aerospace engineer. He does have an affiliation with the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And from 2005 to 2015, he received in excess of $1.2 million from the fossil fuel industry, never disclosing this conflict of interest. And he goes around to universities and talks about how carbon dioxide is good for you. And recently at the University of Wisconsin, he ran into a rather intrepid reporter who someday I'd like to hire. Let's listen to her as she goes after Willie Soon. And then, of course, he has the scientists, of course, have their political partners on Capitol Hill. At the top of this list is the senator from Exxon, Oklahoma, Jim Inhofe, who in 2014, in the midst of a snowstorm in Washington, went to the Senate well. Happened to be cold outside, happened to be a little snow on the ground, and so he thought he'd make a point and settle the debate for once and for all. Case closed, right? He goes on to suggest cold winter weather in Washington means the climate cannot possibly be warming, and he, of course, has received well over $2 million from fossil fuel interests in the course of his political career. Politicians are bad enough, the Willie Soons are bad enough, but if you really look at who's had the most influence on the public over the years, it's weather people, meteorologists. Really, for most people, their only contact with anything close to a scientist is the meteorologist who gives them the weather. And for whatever reason, historically, meteorologists, weathercasters in the United States have been rampant climate change denialists. And part of the reason is, one of the things is, many of these people, when they go to school, they learn meteorology, historically did not learn anything about climate, so didn't have a full understanding of the difference between the two. But there is also a person at the top of his profession at the time, he's now passed away, former Good Morning America weathercaster John Coleman. He founded the Weather Channel, who was a big-time denialist, and many weathercasters saw him as their mentor. So let's listen to a little bit of what John Coleman was feeding them all these years. In 2010, of the 571 television weathercasters surveyed by George Mason University, more than half of them did not believe climate change had any link to human activity. As a matter of fact, 25% of them believed at the time that climate change was, quote unquote, a scam. And at the same time, 56% of Americans trusted weathercasters to tell them the straight stuff about their weather and the climate. So there was a real opportunity there to convince people otherwise. It was kind of wasted, time was wasted. Among the people, interestingly, and he's a friend of mine, colleague at CNN, was Chad Myers. Look at Chad Myers in 2010 on CNN. Well, anybody who knows David Holland knows he's in it for the money, right? Anyway, really, anybody who knows any scientist would find that to be a patently false statement, and shame on Chad. But there's more from Chad in a moment. We do have a redemption story there. One of the problems with journalism is we have a convention of equivalency, right? You go into a political story, so if it's 3 minutes, you give a minute and a half to the Republican, a minute and a half to the Democratic viewpoint. And the theory is if you give it balance, somehow at the end of that, you've achieved some level of something that is close to the truth. The problem with climate change, when you have this stack of peer-reviewed articles with 90+% of the world's scientists saying one thing versus this fringe group of non-peer-reviewed science that is oftentimes paid for by the fossil fuel industry, to give that equivalence is actually nowhere near the truth. And so journalism for many years, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, was trapped in this kind of, well, if we're going to book the climate scientist, we need to book the person who's a nihilist and hash it out, and then we'll have done our journalistic jobs. But this is the kind of thing that would happen. This is Piers Morgan on CNN, and he booked Bill Nye the Science Guy, because that's who they book when they want to talk science. And they, up against Bill Nye was this guy, Mark Morano, who was on Senator Inhofe's staff and runs a big climate denialist website. So take a look at how this debate plays out. In the end, it just confuses people and certainly gets nowhere near the truth. All right, so he throws out Mark Morano with the word salad, and Bill Nye tries to bring it back in. Is that a valuable way to spend network airtime? I would submit not. Interestingly, a few years later, you guys watched Last Week Tonight occasionally with John Oliver. He did a little send-up on this idea, this false equivalence, which leads ultimately to really bias is what it leads to. And he decided to do his own version of a climate change debate on Last Week Tonight. Watch this. Anyways, climate change is a tough sell on TV. This is Jeff Zucker, president of CNN Worldwide. He said this a few years ago. Climate change is one of those stories that deserves more attention, that we all talk about, but we haven't figured out how to engage the audience in that story in a meaningful way. When we do those stories, there does tend to be a tremendous amount of lack of interest on the audience's part. That's a sad statement. That makes me very sad to hear that, because I think it's just a matter of telling good stories. And there are plenty of good stories that are completely relevant and extremely important. It's hard to think of a story that is more important than this one. Back in the days when CNN hired me in 1992, science kind of ruled. It was sponsored at the time by AT&T. And it's an interesting little story on that. In the early days of CNN, when Ted could barely make the payroll, AT&T approached him and said, how would you like to do science coverage on CNN? And Ted is a reasonably altruistic guy and cares deeply about the environment, but more importantly was worried about meeting paychecks. And so when AT&T offered him several $1 million to do 3 science pieces a week and then a weekly science show, he said, yes, we will have a science unit. And so for years, science on CNN was directly linked to a sponsorship. The science piece would air in the middle of the day, and immediately after the science piece aired, a spot for the old Ma Bell would come on, reach out and touch somebody or whatever. And producers were told in no uncertain terms that these spots, my pieces, had to air because it had to do directly with revenue. And so if a producer had some sort of news event that he felt was more important than a science piece, they had to do a make good, and that producer was called on the carpet and had to explain why the science piece didn't air. So science had traction because it had revenue. And during this time, I had a wonderful time. I got to do things like fly on the Vomit Comet, cover space, meet all these Nobel laureates, and really became enamored with the whole scientific enterprise. And we had support. We had a staff of 8 people. All we did was focus on science and technology, producing those 3 pieces and that show. Flying high in my career, it was good. And then, of course, all good things come to an end. In 2008, the science unit at CNN, all 8 of us were shown the door. And guess what happened? CNN got really successful and very profitable. And those science pieces no longer had the linkage to any revenue stream. So they looked at us on the balance sheet and said, well, why do we have these 8 characters here? What do they know about the Kardashians anyway? We want some people who can fill our airtime with something interesting. So they dropped it. And so what did I do? I grew a beard. Day drinking. Anyway, while I was home with the beard, day drinking. I started watching a little CNN between my suicidal thoughts, and it occurred to me what kind of had happened. That room there, that newsroom, is filled with science phobics. Well, after all, I was one once, right? These are poli-sci majors, English majors, history majors, God bless them. And they all had similar experiences with the periodic table, probably, and that's why they ended up in newsrooms doing what they do. And they had a hostile relationship with science. They thought it was wonky, not newsy, or whatever the case may be. I remember one time I worked very long and hard in the early 90s on a piece on buckyballs, Buckminster fullerenes, which is a pretty esoteric branch of science. We didn't have a lot of graphics to make it work. Anyway, I was really proud of the piece, all 3 minutes long. And before anything went on CNN, you had to go down and take the tape down and play it for the supervising producer. So I popped this thing in, and I'm like, oh God, this is going to be interesting. And the producer watches it, and he's like this, and stops it, and he said, I know that was science, but that was actually interesting. That's the truth and all that. So, who needs science when you have people like that in the newsroom and people like this on the air? Yeah, so more data after that. There was a science coverage implosion, 95 weekly science sections in newspapers in 1989. By 2012, there were 19. There are fewer today. Social media changed everything. At first, it seemed like it was going to be great, right? Everybody would have the ability to tell their own story, and kind of a level playing field, and we're all in this together. It was a cool idea until it wasn't, right? Mark Twain, he was the one who supposedly said, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. Ironically, that is fake news, and the credit goes to Jonathan Swift. But in any case, this is the context that we're in when we see stories like this. We see poor Hillary being a UFO, alien child, Mark Zuckerberg dead. These are kind of old. There's new ones we could add. Ebola was a big one for a while. We could add a few coronavirus ones right now. And as a matter of fact, when the coronavirus was raging, I got my dander out. Brian Stelter, who is on CNN and covers the media, has a show called Reliable Sources. And he asked me on to talk about coverage of the Ebola crisis. And you could insert the coronavirus into this discussion, and it'd be pretty much the same. And I kind of launched because I was pretty angry about how it was going and how stupid the coverage can be. Couldn't have said it better myself. So do you think maybe CNN is listening? They have sensed that little diatribe on my part. I'm not saying there's linkage, but they now have a designated climate correspondent, Bill Weir. He doesn't get on TV very often in between the Trump tweets, but he does, he's a good reporter who does good work. He's kind of, I guess, a younger, more handsome version of me, but that's okay. And then, remember our friend Chad Myers, her friend, the denialist weathercaster. In 2019, that's 9 years after you saw him talking to Ali Velshi saying that it was all a hoax, he came out with a mea culpa, that he changed his mind, a complete reversal, and offered up this to viewers. So that's Chad, a new man. So that's progress, right? That may not be a coincidence. What has happened is groups have pushed on this. Climate Central in particular began a very concerted effort to reach out to weathercasters all across the country and give them digestible data, suggestions for graphs to use, for graphics to include in their weathercasts. And really, it's really important, I think, to whenever there's a weather event that has captured people's attention, to explain as best you can, to try to connect the dots. Sometimes the science isn't always there to get you all the way, but at least to give people an idea that science is trying to say, that the reason this storm is wetter has some direct linkage to climate change. Or, maybe we can't say that about tornadoes yet, but we're working on it. That's really important for people, and as weathercasters get that knowledge, there's evidence they're moving in that direction. When I was in Australia, as a matter of fact, they adopted that climate-central approach, and it's on the order of 90% of the weathercasters in Australia right now, where denialism is probably 10 years back of where we are. I mean, you think we've got denialism, the amount of linkage to fossil fuel interests in their economy is tremendous. But the weathercasters there are now offering up climate as a part of their weathercast routine. I'll show you a little bit of the piece I did. So I misspoke, third of the nation. I thought it was a little more, but they're working on it. So there's evidence that tide is turning. I'm giving you some reason for a little bit of hope here. Despite all of the things we see, the fires, the storms, the melting icebergs, the dying coral reefs, 66%, I'll repeat that, 66% of Americans believe human activities have to do with climate change. Unfortunately, only 40% think it's bad enough to really take any serious action. So my theory is, those are the people we need to go after, that 20% gap. Those 66% who are not gonna quibble with you about it happening, but don't think it's urgent enough yet. I don't think it's worth our time to get into debates with hardcore denialists. I don't do it anymore, it's a waste of breath. There are still people who believe the earth is flat. We hear about them occasionally. As a matter of fact, one of them just launched himself, or attempted to launch himself, and prove that the Darwin Award is alive and well. But in any case, I think what is happening is we're going after that 20% gap. And a lot of it has to do, frankly, with this one young lady. It's hard not to listen to that, right? That's moving people. But guess what? Remember the tobacco playbook? Those guys, they aren't giving up. Have you seen this one, guys? The other side has come up with the anti-Greta. Her name is Naomi Siept from Germany, and she is meant to, well, she's funded by the Heartland Institute. I don't know if you know who they are, but they are a big climate denialist organization. And listen to Naomi. So there you have it. That's kind of a rather, well, you can see the tactic. It's pretty clear what's going on. I was able to obtain a rare shot of her in the green room getting makeup on. Low-hanging fruit there, sorry. So although the media coverage of climate change is improving, we have some problems still. Discovery Channel, that's now that's science on the Discovery Channel now. It used to be about, actual science documentaries. We had our friend the Flat Earther the other day who blasted himself into oblivion. There's a lot of really good stories to be told about guys like this guy. And there are some novel ways to do it. It's not that hard. All you have to do is go to B&H and run a bunch of gear, and you come back with a great story. I barely had to leave. I just had to hop on the shuttle, come down to New York. Simple as that. So what should we do? Well, one of the things we need to do is equip ourselves, and it's harder and harder, to sort through, to find the wheat for the chaff in the internet world. Where do you get good information on climate? A few of the places that I go to, it's interesting. When I started at CNN, you could think of journalism as or broadcast media as kind of a department store approach. Kind of one-stop shopping for all things. It's kind of a boutique now. There's lots of little boutiques out there that know where there's some expertise, and because that playing field is so much more level, they have access to an audience that doesn't require a huge amount of investment. This is a great podcast by Andy Westervelt called Drilled. Inside Climate News, subscribe to that one. That's a really good aggregation site, some original reporting. Heated, which is Emily Atkins' newsletter, and Yale Environment's 360 report. All these are good sources, scientifically rigorous ways to learn about climate and get the real story. Of course, you can always watch the PBS NewsHour too. We wouldn't mind if you did that. I do think it's important not to despair. There are solutions out there, and that's a big part of where I want to focus my journalism in the coming months and years. Because it's a big, difficult problem, but it's not one problem, it's a million problems. And that means there's probably a million solutions out there. And there are a lot of smart people that are working on that. As Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So thank you for your time and interest. And if you have any questions, we have some more time for that.